Hi and welcome. My name is Victor Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. In this series of videos we are taking a look at a book by David Lewis called On the Plurality of Worlds. And in this particular video I want to take a look at the 4 final sections of the first chapter. So those would be sections 1.6 to 1.9. In the previous sections, Lewis has been telling us about all the advantages that his own modal realism, or more generally this theory of possible worlds, taking possible worlds talk seriously as the foundation of all our modal talk, he has been trying to show us the advantages of that so that we will want to embrace it. In these 4 sections, 1.6 to 1.9, Lewis is going to give us more details about exactly what his theory entails, or exactly what his theory is. So let's look at those topics. And the first of them is one of the, I would say, 2 more important ones, or at least more important ones in the context of this chapter, and it is isolation. So Lewis is telling us that possible worlds are isolated. And they turn out to be isolated in 2 different, though probably not entirely distinct, ways. First of all, possible worlds are spatio-temporally isolated. So there are no spatio-temporal connections from one world to another. You cannot travel from one world to another through space and time. In fact, Lewis would say you cannot travel to another world at all. But that probably has also to do with the second type of isolation, which is that these possible worlds are causally isolated. Right? Nothing in one world causes anything else in another world, or is caused by anything else in another world. So all spatio-temporal relations and all causal relations are inner-worldly. They happen within one world. They happen between what Lewis calls world mates. Now, when it comes to spatio-temporality, that is what Lewis sort of how Lewis defines worlds, right? He's going to define a world as a maximal set of spatio-temporally related items or entities. So it is by definition the case that possible worlds are, one big chunk of space-time, or something analogous to space-time, but one big chunk of space-time, and that other worlds are other big chunks of space-time, and that there are no spatio-temporal relations between them. That is part of the definition of world. And so one of the things that Lewis has to do here, and which he actually does do here, is he considers the possibility that someone might come to him and say, no, Lewis, that definition is wrong. Right? Clearly we can think of possible worlds that are not spatio-temporal unities. Possible worlds that consist of several space-times that are not connected. And so what Lewis does in the beginning of this section is he gives us a series of science fiction-like scenarios where he says, well, if you have any intuitions like that, if you have any intuitions that make you think that a possible world has to be the kind of thing that could consist of disconnected parts, maybe actually what you're thinking about is one of these things. And all of these things fit into my theory, fit into my definition. And I think he does a relatively good job of it, showing us that at least some of these science fiction scenarios fit his ideas of possible worlds perfectly well. I guess the sort of main problem or the main case that might still be problematic for Lewis is the kind of case where there is no spatio-temporal relation, but there is a causal relation, right? That's the kind of thing where you're thinking of, you think about, somebody stepping into a portal that takes them to a different world, right? Not in some spatio-temporal sense, it's just like, I'm here in this universe. Maybe it's a quite small universe, right? I can just travel to the edges of it and there's no space after that. But in the middle of my world, there is this portal, and when I step through it, bam, I'm in another world. Kind of like mine, just as small, which also has a portal that allows me to travel back. And so there's this causal relation between, me in one world, me in the other world. If there's any kind of scenario that might be problematic for Lewis, it's this kind of scenario. Now, Lewis is going to say that this is wrong, right? That there are no causal relations between possible worlds, that we can understand that there are no causal relations between possible worlds if we understand what causation is, and he will talk about that later on in the section. In the end, this might also be a sort of, I don't know, I'm tempted to say a sort of terminological thing. What do we think is more important, right? The spatio-temporal unity of a world or the causal unity of a world? We would have to sort of delve into those two things, try to see which of them is more fundamental. For David Lewis, given his entire set of philosophical ideas, there can be no question here. Space-time must be more fundamental than causation. Right? Lewis is roughly speaking a Humean. He doesn't think that causation is a fundamental ingredient of reality. Worlds are a fundamental ingredient of reality, and so Lewis clearly chooses to take space and time as sort of the unifying factors of worlds and not causality. But I do think it's good to see that is a choice, and that is a choice based on a particular philosophical framework that Lewis hasn't been very explicit about yet, but is going to be, I would say, quite a bit more explicit about in section 1.8. So, what Lewis does in the second half of this section on isolation is to talk about, well, I should say something else first. What he does in the middle of this section about isolation is he broaches a pretty important topic, which is the question of whether all possible worlds have to be spatio-temporal. Right? I mean, aren't we staying too close to our own world if we take like these fundamental structures of our own world, space and time, and take them as part of the definition of other possible worlds? And what Lewis does here is he says, well, maybe there are other relations, a bit like space and time, which could also form the fundament of a world. But I can't say too much about them because I don't really know what they would be, but also I don't want to deny that they might exist, right? And so he comes up with this idea of relations that are analogous to space-time relations, and those two would be good enough to sort of form the foundation of worlds. And so we see here that Lewis wants a certain kind of richness. He doesn't want space and time to be sort of metaphysically necessary. But of course, it's very hard for him to say what could take the place of space and time. And so we get a relatively vague story about that. But at least Lewis is very clear about the fact that it is vague, right? He tells us himself that it's relatively vague and he would like to do better, but he can't do better. So that's what happens in the middle of the section of isolation. And then at the end of the section of isolation, Lewis is going to talk about causation. He's going to talk about counterfactuals. And basically he gives us his own well-known, I would say, pretty famous theories of how to analyze causation, how to analyze counterfactuals in terms of possible worlds. And he tells us, and this is page 80, he says, so there isn't any trans-world causation, and not because I so stipulate as a principle of demarcation, but as a consequence of my analyses of causation and of counterfactuals. So, strictly speaking, that is true. Right? Given what Lewis has said about worlds, given how he defines causation and counterfactuals, the causal isolation of worlds comes out as a result. That doesn't, of course, that means that like the plausibility of his definition of causation is going to depend on the plausibility of the claim that there is no trans-world causation. Right? So I don't think that this is, some kind of deep philosophical discovery that, we have found out that there is no trans-world causation. It follows from the definition of causation. Yeah, it follows from this definition of causation, but it's a definition of causation that makes trans-world causation impossible. So if somebody did want trans-world causation, I don't think anyone should want that, but if you did want it, you would presumably reject Lewis's definition of causation. But given his theoretical framework, like the structure is this. We define worlds in terms of their unity as space-times, and so their spatio-temporal isolation is part of the definition of worlds, but their causal isolation sort of follows from that as a result. So that brings me to section 1.7, and that section is about concreteness. It's about the question whether possible worlds are concrete or abstract. I'm not going to say too much about it because Lewis himself thinks that this is in many ways not a very important question. He thinks it's a pretty ill-defined question because we don't have a very good grasp of what it is to be abstract or concrete. And so Lewis spends quite a bit of time talking about 4 ways in which we might think about the distinction between abstract and concrete. And he concludes that in all of these 4 ways, using any of these 4 ways, possible worlds are concrete or probably concrete. And so he says, well, I guess I'm going to claim that possible worlds are concrete and not abstract. One of the reasons that he takes so much time setting out these 4 ways of thinking about abstractness and concreteness is that they're going to come back, that this question about abstraction and concreteness is going to come back later on, especially in chapter 3 when we talk about different alternatives to Lewis's own modal realism. That brings us to section 1.8, which I think is by far the most important of these 4 sections for understanding Lewis's theory. So Lewis has, at the beginning of the book, told us that there are lots of possible worlds because, and here we have these 1 and 2, these formulas on page 86, because 1, absolutely every way that a world could possibly be is a way that some world is. And 2, absolutely every way that a part of a world could possibly be is a way that some part of some world is. Now, when we start analyzing, these are modal claims, right? When we start analyzing these modal claims, they turn out to be pretty trivial on Lewis's own analysis, right? To say that every way that a world could possibly be is a way that some world is, turns out to be the claim that every way that a world is a way a world is. All right, I mean, that's not very illuminating. And Lewis agrees with that. He says, okay, let them go trivial. So they are trivial. These phrases don't really tell you anything about what worlds there are. So we need something else. And this is at the bottom of page 87. He says, we need a new way to say what 1 and 2 seemed to say, that there are possibilities enough and no gaps in logical space. And now the crucial passage starts. To which end I suggest that we look to the Humean denial of necessary connections between distinct existences. To express the plenitude of possible worlds, so the fullness of the realm, right, the fact that nothing is missing, the plenitude of possible worlds, I require a principle of recombination, according to which patching together parts of different possible worlds yields another possible world. Roughly speaking, the principle is that anything can coexist with anything else, at least provided they occupy distinct spatio-temporal positions. Likewise, anything can fail to coexist with anything else. So what is Lewis telling us here? Well, he is telling us that, okay, you can just cut and paste from our world. Let's start with our world. You can cut and paste from our world. In any cut and paste sort of new world that you make that way is another possible world. So in our world, my mug of semi-cold tea, and my red pencil are, 30 centimeters apart, something like that. Now I could, in my imagination, we can cut and paste them, right? And we can cut the pen and make it appear right next to the mug. So there is a possible world where this pen is right next to the mug as I am giving this lecture. And there's a possible world where the pen is in the mug as I'm giving this lecture. And there's a possible world where the entire mug is balancing carefully on my head as I give this lecture. And there's also a very unfortunate possible world in which this mug is also balancing on my head, but upside down, and all the lukewarm tea is sort of streaming down my face. All of those are possible worlds because we can create them by cutting and pasting. And all of that seems kind of alright, I mean, is it possible for the mug to be closer to the pen? Well, we might want to say yes. Is it possible for the tea to be covering my head? Well, we might want to, again, say yes. Now, those are examples of cutting and pasting in space, if you want. But we can also cut and paste in time, if that makes any sense. So, in the actual world, this mug is going to remain in existence here for the next, let's say, 10 seconds. 1, 2, 3. But we can create a different situation by cutting and pasting, where we cut some crocodile from the Nile River and we paste it, bam, in the middle of this section so that there's 5 seconds of me holding this mug, and then I'm suddenly holding a crocodile, right? This giant Nile crocodile for 5 seconds while it gets its bearings, and then it eats me, right? That is also a possible world for Lewis, right? And in fact, if you have any possible world up to a certain moment, and you have any other possible world starting at a certain moment, you can just cut and paste them together, right? So there's a possible world that is just like ours, except that in 1802, like at the beginning of the year 1802, it immediately goes to the beginning of the year 2021, and the middle part just doesn't exist. Right, so people are still sort of reeling from the French Revolution, and bam, they're in the middle. Well, they are not in the middle, but other people, we or our counterparts, are in the middle of a corona crisis and stuff like that. That is also a possible world. This is, and we should notice this, we should notice 2 things. The first thing we should notice is that this gives a lot of worlds. Right, this cut and paste procedure generates lots and lots of worlds, including lots and lots of worlds very much like ours, but also lots and lots of worlds that are really, really weird, where things really happen in ways that have nothing to do with the ways that things happen in the actual world. So, Lewis thinks that that's nice, that that's good, that that's an advantage. It gives us plenitude. There are no gaps in logical space. Now, Lewis thinks that there might be gaps, because if we cut and paste from our world, we can only get properties from our world, and there might be other properties. There might be alien properties. Properties that are alien in the sense of they're not part of our world, but only of other worlds. And so we actually need to sort of imagine that we might also be cutting and pasting with those alien properties if we want to get the whole of the space of possible worlds. So, but otherwise, this cut and paste procedure gives a lot of worlds. The second thing we should notice is that the claim that all of these cut and paste scenarios are possible is dependent on, or in some way maybe equivalent to, this Humean denial of necessary connections between distinct existences. Right? So Hume tells us that it is never the case that one event makes another necessary. Like if I clap my hands and that generates a sound, well, according to Hume, it's not necessary that clapping my hands generates a sound. It could just as well not generate a sound. So normally we would say that it's, it seems kind of necessary that this mug of tea remains a mug of tea if, nobody does anything to it. But according to Hume and Lewis, it could just as well suddenly disappear and have a crocodile appear in its place. Right? There's nothing necessary in the world that would prevent that would make that impossible. This is a very controversial metaphysical claim. Right? And Lewis's claim that all these cut and paste worlds are possible worlds is therefore also a very controversial metaphysical claim. It is embracing the Humean idea or the Humean denial of necessary connections. And any philosopher who doesn't follow Hume in denying necessary connections, so any philosopher who maybe is in some kind of Aristotelian mode or in some kind of Kantian way of thinking about this, would deny this, would therefore deny Lewis's principle of recombination, and would therefore deny a lot of the scenarios that Lewis takes for granted in this book. So it is certainly not the case that we are on philosophically neutral ground here. To speak for myself, Lewis says that it is possible for this mug to change into a crocodile, I believe it is impossible for this mug to change into a crocodile. I think that that can't happen. And not can't happen in some restricted sense, which, you know, if we unrestrict it, I end up actually agreeing with Lewis. It just can't happen, right? It's impossible in the most unrestricted sense of impossible that I think makes any sense. So I, for one, do not agree with the Humean denial of necessary connections, and so I can't agree with the cut and paste principle, with this principle of recombination. And so what we are seeing here is that this theory of modality turns out, at least in the way that Lewis is going to use it, in the way that he's going to give it its content and its applicability, and then of course is going to apply it, it turns out to be dependent on his prior Humean metaphysical commitments. And so, again, that is something that we should be very, very much aware of. So that is why I think that the section on plenitude is actually the most important of these 4 sections, because it shows us the kind of metaphysical framework within which Lewis's theory is going to be used, is going to, well, get its content, is going to become the theory that it actually is. And if another philosopher who does not accept this Humean metaphysics, you know, might talk about possible worlds, that philosopher could be talking about something very, very different from what Lewis is talking about, and might have good reasons to reject a lot of the possibilities that Lewis is going to take for granted in the rest of the book. Right? We're going to again and again meet pretty bizarre worlds where Lewis says, well, that's clearly possible and that's clearly possible. Yes, if we accept this Humean denial of necessary connections. Alright, final section of chapter 1 is section 1.9 about actuality, and this sort of points forward to a lot of what's going to happen in chapter 2. Right, so Lewis tells us that, well, what is actual? Right, every world is actual at itself, and thereby all worlds are on a par. This is not to say that all worlds are actual. So here's what Lewis said: we live in the actual world, right? We live in the actual world. What does that mean? Does that mean that we live in a privileged world, like the one world that is actual? Well, actual for Lewis is something just like here or now, right? It doesn't make any sense to say, wow, I am here. I am in the only place that is here. What a privileged place. How marvelous that I happen to be in the here, and by the way, also in the now, and also in the actual world, and I also turn out to be I. Well, I mean, that's all, no. Anyone is here. For them, right? Not here for me, but here for them. Anyone is now for them, anyone is I for them, and anyone is in the actual world for them, right? That's the way that Lewis wants to think about this. And so he's not going to say that all worlds are actual. That doesn't make any sense. Like the world where you are, that is the actual world. But he does think that all worlds are real, or that all worlds are, right? He doesn't think that there's any reason to think of our world as different in kind or different in status from all the other worlds. This is the modal realism part of Lewis's theory. And this is the most, at least in these discussions that Lewis is having with other people, this is the most controversial part. And a lot of chapter 2 is going to be, and also, by the way, a lot of chapter 3 is going to be about the question, should we accept this? Right? Should we accept this or not? Are there alternatives? Are there other ways of thinking about possible worlds that do not require us to be modal realists and believe that all these worlds are, that they exist? And Lewis is going to argue that his theory is the best. Of course, I mean, otherwise it wouldn't be his theory, right, if he didn't think it was the best. So this is the most controversial part. For myself, I think that, if you've gone as far with Lewis this far, it kind of makes sense to be a modal realist, right? If you really believe that in order to understand possibilities, we need possible worlds, that is sort of the foundation of any idea about possibility that we have, then I don't really see why you would want to not embrace modal realism. Well, unless you think that one of the alternatives of chapter 3 is much better. So that's something that we'll have to check out when we come to chapter 3. Of course, I'm not a modal realist because I don't accept the possible worlds analysis of modality, but that is another thing. That is, a disagreement at a different level. All right, that is what I wanted to say about chapter 1. In chapter 2, Lewis is going to move on to counter-arguments against his theory or problems of his theory, and he's going to try to show that, his theory actually works and can handle all of these problems. So let's look at that the next time.